Let's talk a little bit about fonts. So what is a font? A font's a recognizable, distinct design of a collection of characters in a particular typeface. You're probably all familiar with fonts. I'm in Microsoft Word here, and everybody knows when you come up here, if you've used any kind of text editor at all, any kind of word processing, you have different fonts that you can use, different styles of characters that you can use in your Microsoft Word document. Well, we can use different kind of fonts on the web as well. A font family is a set of fonts that have similar characteristics. Over here we can see some different generic font families. So what's a generic font? A generic font attempts to duplicate as many features of a specific font as possible. So there are 5 generic fonts used in web page design. We can have serif fonts, sans serif, monospace, cursive, and fantasy. The generic fonts are designed to be cross-platform. So we try to use generic fonts, fonts that if we specify them on our web page, the user looking at the web page is likely to have on their computer. So especially years ago, a Windows computer, they used a particular set of fonts, and they'd come pre-installed with some. And a Mac might come with different sets of fonts installed. But there was only a few that we could be pretty sure that both systems would have on their computer. Today, we probably get more fonts, and probably a lot more of them are cross-platform. But we want to stick to the ones that we're sure will render well. Now, there are ways to embed fonts in our web pages. That's a more advanced topic, and we'll talk about that later. So we can guarantee the fonts to the users, but in general, we don't do that. It just takes that much more bandwidth and more requests from the server in order to do that. So we'll talk about that much later, but for now, we're going to stick to the basics of fonts. What are the difference between different fonts? So the letters in a serif font have finishing strokes. So over here, the generic font family are serif fonts. They're fonts that have a serif. If we look at Georgia or Times New Roman, they have finishing strokes. Let me enlarge Georgia here. So you can see on the G, when it comes around, it's got these nice little leading I don't know how you call it. Well, finishing strokes, I guess, is a good description for it, right? We come down and it has this nice little tag hanging off of it here. The R's got little tags hanging off on the left and right here. This G has a little tag hanging off. And generally, I think serif fonts are supposed to, the idea is it helps your eye flow from one letter to the next by pointing your way over to the next letter, and they lead into each other better. So I think that's the idea behind serif fonts. So Georgia and Times New Roman are both web safe, meaning they're good to use on the web. They are web safe fonts that are serif fonts. Okay. A sans serif font, sans being, I believe, French for without. Okay, fonts that don't have serifs, without serifs. So if we look at Arial here, we can see it's a much simpler style font. Okay. It doesn't have the finishing strokes that we saw in the serif fonts. A monospace font has a fixed width for each letter. So we use monospace fonts a lot in coding. That's what makes all our tabs and spacing line up with each other perfectly. Proportional fonts are the opposite of monospace. Anything that's not monospace is probably proportional, meaning this I, because it's thin, its character takes up less space than this capital A. But in a monospace font, they all take the exact same width. And that's really great for code because we know we like to line our code up and we like to use tabs and spaces and indents. to line our code up visually to make it easier to read and easier to see the structure of our code. So monospace fonts work well with that. Fantasy fonts are artistic and decorative. There really are no safe, reliable fantasy fonts that you should be using. And cursive fonts are kind of simulate handwriting. The most popular one is the familiar Comic Sans. If you use Comic Sans in my class, you automatically fail that assignment. You think I'm joking? I kind of am, but I'm kind of not. Don't use Comic Sans. It looks very unprofessional. It's not a great font. It got really, really popular back in the 90s, and admittedly, I used it more than I should have, and so did a lot of people. So that's the basics of fonts. In the next video, I will show you how to actually set the fonts on your page.